Hello, I'm David Kerr, Professor of Cancer Medicine from the University in Oxford, and I'd like to talk a little today about how we communicate with patients. This is current in my mind because on Friday after clinic, I popped round to see a couple of patients who were in our local hospice. They were there for end-of-life care, being wonderfully well looked after. These were patients I've looked after for 3, 4, 5 years, patients who I cared for, patients of whom I was fond. And I think that relationship was reciprocated by them. But I found myself in the hospice standing at the patient's bedside, towering above them, effectively saying goodbye. And it's just the dynamics of that setting just made me think about how odd it seemed. We know that any effective communication between patients and doctors is absolutely critical and fundamental to the delivery of patient-centred care. But it's really hard to measure and challenging to attain in the dynamic, often noisy environment of a busy ward, or even in the relative peace and quiet of a hospice. We know that specific behaviour and part of doctors can make a real difference to how they're perceived by the patient, their communicative skills and so on. And I've been a doctor for more than 40 years, but sophisticated communicator though I think I am, there I was standing by the bedside. Really interesting, odd, actually, when you stop and think about it. And there's an increasing body of evidence to suggest that if the physician sits at the patient's bedside, establishes better, more direct eye-to-eye contact and so on, then the quality of communication, the patient satisfaction is improved. So I picked up on a recent study published just a few days ago in the British Medical Journal, and the title of the study was The Effective Chair Placement on Physicians' Behaviour and Patient Satisfaction. And the study design was a randomised deception trial. It was done in a single centre. There were 125 separate physician interactions. In half of them, the chair in the patient's room was in its conventional place, back against a wall, round a corner, not particularly accessible. And the randomisation, the active intervention, if you like, was to have a chair placed less than 3 feet from the patient's bed, at the patient's eye level. And what was really interesting was that we discovered that of these randomised interventions, in the setting in which the chair placement was close to the patient's bed, it was accessible less than 3 feet, 38 of the 60 physicians sat down in the chair and engaged with the patient from that level. Whereas in the other setting, which the chair wasn't immediately adjacent to the bedside, it was parked back against the wall out of the way, only in 5 out of 60 did the physician retrieve the chair and move it to the right position to do things that way. Otherwise, they stood and talked to the patient in that way. The patient satisfaction scores that were measured using a conventional tool were much higher, were much better for those seated physicians rather than those who stood and towered above. I mean, an interesting wee study, statistically significant. It didn't mean that the physicians who spent more time with the patient. It was the same in both settings, about 10, 11 minutes. It didn't alter the physician's perception of how long they spent with the patient. Again, they guessed it was around 10 minutes, equally on both sides. Or indeed the patient's interpretation of how long the physician sat for. So it wasn't a temporal thing, but just the quality of communication, the patient satisfaction was much better just simply by sitting at the patient's bedside and engaging with them. A tiny thing to do, but had, a significant qualitative improvement in how we went about things. So I've learned that lesson. So no more towering above, no more standing at the bottom of the patient's bedside, as I was taught and as I've always done. So I'm going to nudge my behaviour. I'm going to use the psychology of that small study to nudge myself, the junior doctors that I train, perhaps even my consultant colleagues, to do the same. So a small but effective step forward in improving patient-centred communication. I'd be interested to see what you thought. How many of you stand? Me, old school, I would have thought most of us. But how many of you make the effort to drag the chair over, to sit at the patient's bedside, and to engage more fully? I'd be really interested in any comments that you've got. Yeah. So for the time being, Medscapers, over and out, and ahoy. Thanks for listening.